In this lecture, we're going to approach Virginia Woolf, and I think this will break down into two parts, but we're going to approach Virginia Woolf through the essay Mr. Brown and Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown. Um, and particularly I want to think about this phrase of hers, in or about December 1910, human consciousness changed. Here's Virginia Woolf. Her dates, as you'll see, put her of a generation that were coming to their artistic maturity. They were beginning to write their serious fiction right before World War One. This is the same generation as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. It's the great modernist generation, slightly older, what we might say is half a generation older than most of those writers who we've been looking at who went off to fight in World War One. Now, Virginia Woolf published Mrs. Dalloway, which is in many ways her breakthrough modernist novel, in 1925. Here is the original cover of it. It's published by the Hogarth Press. The Hogarth Press was Virginia Woolf's own press, which she set up with her husband, Leonard Woolf, partly for therapeutic reasons. Virginia Woolf suffered intermittently from mental illness and was told by her doctors that the kind of routine activity that setting press pages and so on would give her was actually very helpful for her mental stability. But I think more important than that, at least in terms of her work as a novelist, is that it gives her a great freedom. She doesn't have to worry so much about what publishers want, what she thinks the reading public want, because she can publish her own work. And the Hogarth Press it's not vanity publishing, it's a successful publishing enterprise, though on a pretty small scale. And she is able to really work through ideas she has about fiction and work out what she wants to do at length, knowing that she can publish her own work. Now, as she's working her way towards Mrs. Dalloway, she is thinking a lot about the nature of fiction and what fiction should do, and she publishes a number of essays that try to articulate that. And perhaps the most important, and certainly the most important for our purposes, is Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, which is published, again, by the Hogarth Press as a pamphlet in 1924. So this is very much what's on her mind as she's writing Mrs. Dalloway. Now, you remember she says in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown that she's imagining a situation in which there's a seemingly undistinguished, unimportant-looking elderly woman sitting in the corner of a train car, and Woolf begins to wonder what her life is, what lies behind her strange antagonism to the man that she's talking to, where is she going, where does she come from, and she sees in this the beginnings of a novel. This is how a novel might begin to take root in the writer's mind. And then she imagines, well, supposing I was trying to do this in the Edwardian era, that's the period from 1901 to 1910, before the great upheavals that are represented by World War I in particular. What would the writers of that era, the great major writers in Britain in the Edwardian era, what would they make of Mrs. Brown? What would they write about her? So we've got H.G. Wells, and you can see he really is of a previous generation, born 1866. He's best known these days for writing science fiction, for writing some of the earliest and I think most brilliant science fiction around the turn of the century. Works like The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau are still extremely important works of science fiction and still very readable. By the end of the Edwardian era, so we're talking about 1909, 1910, Wells has moved away from writing speculative fiction, whether he's writing about utopias or dystopias, and is trying to write what we might call sociological fiction about the functioning of society. He's using some of the traditional methods of fiction to try to sort of x-ray the social machine, to try to understand how it works, what are the great forces that shape society. Wells becomes a committed socialist around the end of the Edwardian period and is committed to social change. He has a very pacifistic attitudes as World War One goes on, and wants to see the world changed for the better. But for Woolf, I think this means that Mrs. Brown, the individuality, the singularity, the specific nature of who Mrs. Brown is, what runs through her consciousness is lost. Wells can't approach that because he's so concerned with what looks like the bigger picture, the biggest picture of all, the place of society and the place of our society or Edwardian society within the structure of history. Then we've got John Galsworthy, who's a very successful novelist of the Edwardian era. He's best known today for the Forsyte Saga, which is this brilliantly witty book about a family, a prosperous family in the late years of the Victorian era and what makes them tick, and particularly their relationship to the laws and structures of late era imperialism, we might say, their very British empirical fixation upon property and things like that. So he situates his characters within the structures of law. There are great scenes that have to do with the workings of the law and within the workings of the marketplace and these social forces that people have to deal with within their class on a daily basis. But again, he's not especially interested in what's actually flowing through his characters in terms of their immediate consciousness. So he too, no doubt, for Virginia Woolf, would somehow leave the real essence of Mrs. Brown out of account. And then perhaps for Virginia Woolf, most interesting of all, Arnold Bennett. Here are his dates. He's of the same generation, 1867 to 1931. Arnold Bennett is influenced by French writers, is the great descriptive novelist. He knows exactly what kind of room Mrs. Brown would live in, what she would see looking out of her windows, what the rent in her apartment would be, what she would have above the fireplace, what she might see out of the window, the sort of dreary backs of the houses and so on. All of that Arnold Bennett captures very brilliantly. He writes about lower middle class people typically in the Midlands of England, the industrial part of England. It's called the Potteries, the Five Towns. He invents characters. He's very interested in women characters. But again, somehow for Virginia Woolf, he just misses the essence of what makes Mrs. Brown essentially different and specific and unique. What he misses through an overemphasis on the description of exterior surfaces, we might say, what the wallpaper looks like, what the house is, and so on. Well, we'll come on to Virginia Woolf's sense of what novelists should be doing in the next lecture. And we'll see how her solution or her approach to the novel, and she's really trying to sort of invent it almost page by page, is actually different from the great writers of the Edwardian era. She calls herself, in effect, a Georgian. She is a writer of the new era and what we would call these days a modernist.